Have you ever wondered what could make international investors pull billions of dollars out of a country almost overnight? Well, it's happening right now in South Africa, and the reason is a single highly controversial new law that has sent shockwaves through the global financial community. We are talking about a policy that could reshape the nation's economy and put its future at risk. Today, we're diving deep into South Africa's Expropriation Bill. We'll break down what this law actually says, why it's causing such a panic among investors, and what it means for the future of one of Africa's largest economies. Is this a necessary step towards justice, or is it an economic gamble with potentially devastating consequences? Stick around, because the story is far more complex than you might think. First, let's get to the heart of the matter. What exactly is this law that's causing so much concern? It's called the Expropriation Bill, and at its core, it gives the South African government the power to take land and property for public use or in the public interest. Now, the concept of expropriation, or what some might call eminent domain, isn't new. Most countries, including the United States and the UK, have laws like this. They're typically used to acquire land for public infrastructure projects like roads, schools, or hospitals. The government is usually required to pay fair market value, or just and equitable compensation, to the property owner. So, what makes South Africa's version so different and so controversial? The key phrase is nil-compensation. The bill outlines specific circumstances where the government could expropriate land without paying the owner anything at all. This is the part that has set off alarm bells. These circumstances include land that is held purely for speculative purposes, land owned by state-owned enterprises, or property that has been abandoned. Proponents of the bill argue this is a crucial tool to address the deep-seated inequalities in land ownership that are a direct legacy of apartheid, a system where the black majority was systematically dispossessed of their land. For them, this law isn't about seizing property indiscriminately. It's about reclaiming land to correct historical injustices and promote more equitable development. They argue that for decades, willing buyer, willing seller models have failed to make a significant dent in land reform, and a more radical approach is needed. From that perspective, the goal is social and economic justice. The government has repeatedly stated that the law will not be used to arbitrarily grab productive farms or people's homes, and that its application will be reasonable and subject to court oversight. The aim, they say, is to unlock unused or underutilized land to be used for housing, agriculture, and industrial development, ultimately benefiting the landless majority. However, for international investors and many local property owners, this assurance is not nearly enough. Their view is dramatically different, and it's rooted in one fundamental principle of a market economy: the protection of private property rights. For any investor, whether they're putting money into stocks, bonds, or physical assets like factories and farms, the belief that their ownership is secure is paramount. Property rights are the bedrock of a stable and predictable investment climate. When you invest your capital, you do so with the expectation that you own the asset and have a right to the returns it generates. The introduction of a nil-compensation clause, no matter how carefully worded or well-intentioned, fundamentally undermines that security. It introduces a massive element of political risk. Investors are now asking themselves a series of frightening questions. What if the definition of public interest is expanded in the future? What if a future government decides that my factory, my commercial building, or my farm falls under one of the categories for expropriation without compensation? The law creates uncertainty, and if there's one thing global capital hates, it's uncertainty. The potential for losing an entire investment without any form of payment is a risk that most are simply unwilling to take. They see it as a potential slippery slope. Today it might be abandoned land, but tomorrow could it be any property deemed underutilized by a government official? This fear isn't just theoretical, it has real-world consequences. The immediate effect we're seeing is a phenomenon known as capital flight. This is when large sums of money are moved out of a country due to a perceived increase in risk. Foreign investors, who were once considering new projects in South Africa, building new mines, factories, or renewable energy plants, are now putting those plans on hold. They're looking at neighboring countries like Botswana or Namibia, or even markets further afield, that offer a more stable and predictable legal framework for property rights. It's not that they are against the idea of land reform, but the method being proposed is seen as a direct threat to the rules of the game. The numbers are already starting to reflect this anxiety. We're seeing a weakening of the South African currency, the rand, as foreign currency flows out. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange has experienced volatility, and credit rating agencies like Moody's and S&P have repeatedly warned that any erosion of property rights could lead to a downgrade of South Africa's credit rating. Their downgrade makes it more expensive for the government and South African companies to borrow money on the international market, which in turn stifles economic growth. It creates a vicious cycle. The law is meant to solve an economic problem, but its implementation could trigger a much larger economic crisis. Billions of dollars in foreign direct investment, or FDI, which are crucial for job creation and economic development, are now hanging in the balance. The economic risks don't stop with foreign investors. Local South African property owners, businesses and banks are also deeply concerned. Think about the banking sector. Banks issue mortgages and business loans using property as collateral. If the value of that collateral can suddenly become zero by a government decree, the entire banking system is exposed to massive risk. A bank might be hesitant to lend money for a new farm or a commercial development if they fear the underlying asset could be expropriated without compensation. This could lead to a credit crunch, where it becomes much harder and more expensive for ordinary South Africans and businesses to get loans. This tightening of credit would have a devastating ripple effect across the economy. Farmers would struggle to get financing for seeds and equipment, crippling food production. The construction industry would slow down as developers find it impossible to fund new housing projects. Ultimately, this could lead to higher unemployment and slower economic growth, hurting the very people the law is intended to help. Critics argue that instead of creating prosperity and opportunity, the bill could inadvertently destroy wealth and destabilize the economy. They point to the historical example of Zimbabwe, where a similar fast-track land reform program in the early 2000s led to a collapse in agricultural output and hyperinflation, from which the country has yet to fully recover. While South Africa's leaders insist their situation is different and that they will manage the process responsibly, the Zimbabwean precedent looms large in the minds of many investors. So where does this leave South Africa? The country is caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, there is a moral and political imperative to address the injustices of the past. The gross inequality in land ownership is a source of social and political instability, and failing to address it is not an option. The status quo is unsustainable. For millions of South Africans, land ownership is not just an economic issue, it's about dignity, identity, and a stake in the country's future. They see the fear of foreign investors as a defense of a system that has benefited a small minority for far too long. On the other hand, alienating international investors and destabilizing the economy is not a viable path to prosperity. South Africa needs foreign capital to fund its development, create jobs, and compete on the global stage. Without that investment, the country's economic woes could worsen, making it even harder to tackle poverty and inequality. The government is therefore walking a tightrope. They need to find a way to implement meaningful land reform that empowers the majority of its citizens without completely torpedoing investor confidence and crashing the economy. The path forward is incredibly narrow and fraught with challenges. The final version of the bill is still being debated and will almost certainly face legal challenges that could go all the way to the country's constitutional court. The key will be in the implementation. Will the government be surgical and restrained, targeting only genuinely abandoned or state-owned land as promised? Or will political pressure lead to a broader, more aggressive application of the law? The international community is watching very, very closely. The fate of South Africa's economy and the livelihoods of its millions of citizens may well depend on the answer. It's a high-stakes balancing act between righting the wrongs of the past and securing a prosperous future. The final outcome is anything but certain. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think the economic risks are worth the potential for social justice? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this analysis helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next video. Thanks for watching.